I'm Carla Millette. I'm director of the Center for European Studies, one of the sponsors of this talk. I wanted to, before I begin, with deep gratitude, thank the other sponsors of the talk, the Department of Classical Studies, Department of Comparative Literature, and the Modern Greek program, who all contributed generously to this event. It's my deep pleasure to introduce Panayotis Iapitos, a scholar of Byzantine literature who approaches the medieval Mediterranean from a very cosmopolitan and global perspective. He is, in fact, himself, I think, a citizen of the cosmos, and a student of the world, as his CV reveals. Panayotis received his MA in Byzantine Studies, the History of Byzantine Art and Musicology from the Ludwig Maximilians Universität in Munich. That was for my pronunciation. Did you see that? Yeah, that was for my pronunciation. He got his PhD in Byzantine philology from Harvard University in 1990 and taught there for a couple of years until he moved to the University of Cyprus. Since March 2001, he has been professor of Byzantine philology there at the University of Cyprus. He has taught as visiting professor at the Freie Universität Berlin, the École des Hautes Études in Sciences Sociales in Paris, and Stanford University in Palo Alto. And also had a term as a distinguished visiting professor, distinguished visiting scholar at the Dumbarton Oaks Research Center in Washington, D.C. And Panayotis has published extensively on Byzantine literature. He's the author of 3 monographs, if I'm counting right, on Byzantine literature. He also produced the first critical edition of the 13th century verse romance, Lévi-Strauss and Rodamny. And he's co-editor of a volume of essays on medieval European literature. He also has a long-standing interest in ekphrasis and has published a collection of translations into modern Greek of Byzantine descriptions of works of art. He's the author of numerous articles, at least 50, on a fascinating list of topics involving the arcane topic of the history of Byzantine literature. The man has a capacious and a restless mind, and as you can imagine, is a lot of fun to think with. In fact, I first met him as a founding member of the Center for Medieval Literature, which is a group of sort of visionary scholars who received a large grant from the Danish National Research Foundation, and who meet in order to propose connective and interdisciplinary views of the literatures of medieval Europe. And Panayotis' contributions to these discussions are always precious and lively and often startling. And so, on to the topic for today, something completely different. Panayotis is also, in addition to all of his academic writings, he's also the author of a series of detective novels that are set in the Byzantine past. And he's going to talk to us today about the ways in which modern popular culture, mystery novels in particular, negotiate with the medieval past. The title of his talk is Visually Demolished and Textually Reconstructed, The Middle Ages in Contemporary Crime Fiction. And there's a handout over there on the table in case anybody hasn't got it. Please join me in welcoming Panayotis Iapitos.
Thank you, Carla. I am delighted to be here. It's my first time in Ann Arbor, and I have been very lucky that the weather is so nice, and I'm getting the full sense of the North American Indian summer, which I miss since the times I was at Harvard. I am very particularly honored for the invitation and very grateful to the sponsors of the event for bringing me here from the other end of the Mediterranean. And as Carla said, I will be talking to you not so much as a Byzantinist, but as a reader and writer of historical crime fiction, talking about the image of the Middle Ages in contemporary crime fiction writing today, which has become extremely fashionable and very lucrative as a publishing activity. So, by the way, I don't have any PowerPoint, so I will be just talking to you, and the handout is nothing else but a list of the names of various crime writers that I will be talking about or partly referring to, so as I won't need to give you dates and such burdensome information. So the historical novel as a clearly defined genre of fiction made its first appearance in European literature with the publication of Sir Walter Scott's Ivanhoe in 1819, almost 200 years ago. Ivanhoe also was the first depiction of the Middle Ages in fiction by means of a consciously historicist perspective, even if it had been viewed, the Middle Ages, through the looking glass of Romanticism. Scott's England of the 12th century formed part of a broader European discovery of medieval folklore, if we put it in quotation marks, be it the ballads and folk tales of various people or the epic and romantic verse narratives in the various medieval vernaculars. This folkloric and romantic Middle Ages was taken out of the drawers of scholarship since the 18th century, partly to support the creation of the new nation states by literally translating the roots of a nation's birth to a remote and at any rate pre-Renaissance past, contributing in this manner to the construction of a national unity in space and time. In a number of European literatures, the plots of significant historical novels were placed in some specific period of the Middle Ages, which was viewed as crucial for each nation, like the 12th century for England, or the 13th century in Greece, or the 5th century in Germany. Within this ideological framework, the image of the Middle Ages gradually solidified for the broader public into a restricted set of highly resilient stereotypes. It became the age of noble chivalry, chivalrous adventure, and of course, courtly love. All of it extremely clean, by the way. In the historical novel, until the middle of the 20th century, the dark sides of the Middle Ages, imaginatively constructed or reconstructed through historical and archaeological research, were not explored. However, an important change took place in the 60s, and it came from theater and film. Edward Albee's 1963 play, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, wherein the American playwright depicted the morbid relation of a middle-aged married couple in New York, gave the idea to the young British playwright James Goldman to transfer this psychotic framework to the conflict-ridden relationship of King Henry II Plantagenet and his wife Eleanor of Aquitaine, parents, as is well known, of the later kings Richard I and John I. Goldman's The Lion in Winter, staged in London's West End in 1966, made such an impression that it was immediately adapted for the screen and released in 1968, starring Peter O'Toole as Henry and Katharine Hepburn as Eleanor, and the very young Anthony Hopkins as Richard I, and as his supposedly young homoerotic relationship, King Philip of France, no less than Timothy Dalton, later James Bond actor. In the film version, the Middle Ages as a space of noble and clean chivalry has been completely cancelled. King Henry lives with his sons in a dirty, cold and murky Norman castle, while the royal couple tear each other psychologically apart in a very modern way. Until the middle of the 70s, a series of important films advanced the visual demolishing, at least for the broader public, of the romantic image of the noble Middle Ages. I would single out the 1974 comedy Monty Python and the Holy Grail, written, directed, and played by the brilliant Monty Python team. The film, whose action supposedly takes place in exactly 963 AD, parodies not so much the Middle Ages as a historical period, but rather the popular image of the Middle Ages, and more specifically the British image of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. The highly exact sets and costumes, the realism in the depiction of everyday life among knights and peasants, the epic filming techniques form an impressive and serious depiction of a different Middle Ages. At the same time, this serious depiction is completely deconstructed on the level of the plot. The king and his knights have no horses, but walk pretending to ride like children would. The beautiful prince proves to be an effeminate papa's boy. The beautiful princess is ugly and vulgar. Lancelot and Galahad are fools. The peasants talk like workers in a socialist kolkhoz, while at the end, the police, Scotland Yard, interferes with patrol cars and vans in order to arrest the crazy knights. At the end of the 70s, 3 works appeared that in their own way contributed decisively to the popularizing of the different and criminal Middle Ages, and it will be necessary to look at them more closely because I believe that they are constitutive in this new image making. Edith Pargeter, who had made a modest success by writing conventional crime stories and historical novels in the 50s and the 60s, published in 1977 under the pen name of Elise Peters, A Morbid Taste for Bones. In this medieval mystery, the hero is the Welsh monk, herbalist, and one-time crusader Cadfael, who is called upon to solve various crimes in the town of Shrewsbury and its environs in the 1130s and 1140s. The first novel was followed within 3 years by another 4, by this time appearing under the broader series heading The Cadfael Chronicles. The success of these novels in England was such that Elise Peters was hailed as the medieval Agatha Christie, a rather apt comparison, since her novels were based on the formula of the British crime story of the 20s and the 30s, also known amongst American critics in particular as cozy mysteries. The fairly exact historical representation of the 12th century setting is supported by a discrete realism. Violence and sex are only hinted at. Psychological character drawing is limited. Good and bad roles are clearly distinguished. The style is simple, while a pleasant sort of humor and a positive view of life suffuses the third-person narrator's world view. This is how the 5th novel, its title is The Leper of St. Giles. It was published in 1981. I think it is her best novel. Opens like this. Brother Cadfael set out from the gatehouse that Monday afternoon of October in the year 1139, darkly convinced that something ominous would have happened before he re-entered the great court, though he had no reason to suppose that he would be absent more than an hour or so. He was bound only to the hospital of St. Giles, at the far end of the monks' foregate, barely half a mile from Shrewsbury Abbey, and his errand was merely to replenish with oils, lotions, and ointments the medicine cupboard of the hospital. For to make it all plain, Cadfael's forebodings had nothing whatever to do with the momentous events soon to be visited upon the Abbey of St. Peter and St. Paul of Shrewsbury. No reference to marrying and giving in marriage, no omens of sudden and violent death. He was expecting rather that in his absence some vessel full of precious liquid would be broken, some syrup left to boil over, some pan to burn dry in his workshop in the herb gardens. End of quote. Date and place of the medieval setting is immediately stated, while the narrative is lovingly adorned with homely details. The hero's ominous forebodings, following the narrator's comment about the actual plot of the story, proves to be of minor importance, eliciting, however, a smile from the knowledgeable reader. The sense that some form of happy end will come about and that the world's good order will be restored is effectively evoked. This is the technique of the cozy mystery at its best. In the autumn of 1980, the voluminous Name of the Rose was published in Italy, written by Umberto Eco, at that point a well-known theoretician and literature critic in Italy, now a superstar of the intellectual scene. During that year, then this is very important for Italy, during that year, an extended and passionate discussion had reached its peak in the Italian press and the leading literary journals, and it concerned the supposed end of fiction because of the publication of Italo Calvino's Se in una notte d'inverno un viaggiatore, if in one winter night a traveler, and then nothing in the title, had been published. The Name of the Rose, set in an imaginary abbey of northern Italy in the early 14th century, kindled even more strongly the heated discussions of the critics, since it blatantly parodied a series of literary conventions, among which also those of classic crime fiction. The novel invites the readers to participate in a postmodern game of intertextual dialogues and semiotic inversals on the basis of Arthur Conan Doyle's detection stories, Jorge Luis Borges's modernist narratives, and Thomas of Aquinas's scholastic theology. In no way did Eco attempt to reconstruct historically the late Middle Ages, but rather presented a kaleidoscope of images that fragment the narrative and inflate the grotesque. Immense critical acclaim was lavished upon the novel outside Italy, helping it to become an international bestseller of a supposedly crime detection character, a supposition that was reinforced by its adaptation for film in 1986 with no less than Sean Connery in the role of William of Baskerville. Between the publication of Illes Peters's and Umberto Eco's novels, there appeared another work that played, in my opinion, an important part in the popular dissemination of the different Middle Ages. George Lucas's Star Wars was released in late May 1977. The movie became the greatest financial success of the American film industry up to that point and received 7 Oscars for its visual, acoustic, and technical achievements. The story pattern of this space saga adheres closely to the younger versions of Arthurian mythology, as codified, for example, in Sir Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur and its numerous popular adaptations. In Star Wars, the good Jedi Knights, standing for justice, equality, and chivalric nobility, their old and wise master Obi-Wan Kenobi, superbly played, of course, by Sir Alec Guinness, the hidden and initially rather naive savior Luke Skywalker, the apparently utilitarian but ultimately chivalrous rebel Han Solo, played by Harrison Ford, the evil Black Knight Darth Vader, played by towering David Prowse, with the menacingly deep voice of the American stage actor James Earl Jones, the dual fighting of the knights with their lightsabers, the presence of the Force, you remember, may the Force be with you, as a semi-religious guarantor of moral values, fully reflect the Knights of the Round Table and the wise sorcerer Merlin, the young Arthur, Gawain, the evil Mordred, and the ethics of chivalry. Never before the release of Star Wars had the popular mythology of the Middle Ages reached such a broad and diverse public. The technological world of an epic future, moreover, in settings and costumes that Lucas himself described as projecting a used effect, shabby dwellings, dirty clothes, less than shiny spaceships, and so on, was important because it came to validate an epic past. Thus, in accentuating the supposedly archetypal patterns of the battle between good and evil, Star Wars brought the Middle Ages and the galaxy together as interrelated fictional spaces of the fantastic. The success of Ellis Peters continued undiminished well into the 90s with translations in many European languages, including modern Greek, and a BBC series with Sir Derek Jacobi as Cadfael. The Cadfael Chronicles triggered the production of further medieval cozy mysteries, all of them written by women writers such as Kate Sedley or Alice Clare. However, in 1986, Paul Doherty, with a doctorate in English medieval history from Oxford, published his medieval mystery called Satan in St. Mary's. The story is set in 1284 in London, that is during the early years of the reign of King Edward I, and its hero is the secretary Hugh Corbett, one-time monk and soldier. The novel, realistically in quotation marks, depicts the squalor of a medieval town, everyday violence from criminals to the king's executioners, and sexuality, whores, whoring boys, scenes of sex in the middle of the streets. The fairly literary style includes substantial amounts of irony and humor. Major historical figures, such as King Edward and his Chancellor Robert Burnell, are actual characters in the plot. Recognizable anachronisms make their appearance in the dialogues and in the characters' attitudes, while medieval English society of the late 13th century appears like a peculiar mixture of ideological conservatism on the one hand and naive dissoluteness on the other. The sleuth, Hugh Corbett, acts sometimes as if he were a hero of an American hard-boiled crime novel living in Raymond Chandler's Los Angeles, while he involves himself in a classic love affair with the novel's equally classic femme fatale who goes by the name of Alice Bow. Alice has, in my opinion, been modeled on the unscrupulous Milady in Alexander Dumas's Three Musketeers of 1844. Even her actual physical description is identical to the description of the Milady. While the damned relation of Hugh and Alice is blatantly modeled on the affair between Sam Spade and Bridget O'Shaughnessy in Dashiell Hammett's The Maltese Falcon of 1930. Damned because she is the murderer, right? Doherty's novels, who has published until now 44 successful titles of medieval mysteries, with translations again in a number of European languages, are what I would call the first phase in the revision of the cozy Middle Ages. Satan in St. Mary's opens first with a very brief introduction, that's the title that the author gives to this short text, and then the actual chapter 1. These are the respective openings of the two narrative units. Introduction. A savage, cold wind had sprung up just after dark. It steered and rippled the black water of the Thames, hit the moored ships, and sent them moving and straining at their ropes. The decaying corpses of 3 river pirates twisted and twirled in the wind to the creak of the scaffold overhead. Ghostly dancers grimly turning to macabre music. The wind pierced the alleys and rutted tracks of the city, freezing the mud and ordure, driving deeper into the darkness those human predators of the shadows who might still be hunting for any unfortunate abroad on such a dark and miserable night. Chapter 1. Edward, King of England and Duke of Aquitaine, sat in the small, sparse chamber of his palace at Westminster. Few people knew he was in the capital, for he had only returned at the urgent insistence of his Chancellor, Robert Burnell, Bishop of Bath and Wales. Exhausted after his journey, Edward crouched over a small fiery red brazier, his cloak wrapped about him, trying to ignore the cold wind which battered insistently on the wooden shutters. Edward eventually rose and crossed the room to ensure they were closed fast. It was dark outside, the city and river concealed by thick mists. Only the moaning of the wind and the howling of some street dog cut through the eerie silence. The king shivered and jumped as a rat rustled the herb-strewn rushes. A room with too many dark corners, the king thought, hidden from the torches flickering in their sconces on the wall. Shadows everywhere, Edward muttered to himself, and returned to crouch over the brazier and examine the shadowy ghosts who haunted his own soul. The description of a ghostly winter's night in London and of the king in his cold and rat-infested room, haunted in a very modern psychological manner by the ghosts of the past, sets a very different tone than the cozy atmosphere of the Cadfael Chronicles. Doherty's London is by itself the social urban space generating crime, just as secular and ecclesiastical institutions are spaces of violence and corruption. Thus, Doherty consciously reconstructs the darker sides of the Middle Ages while paying tribute to their visual demolition by Monty Python and George Lucas, because in fact, the scene with the dangling corpses is directly taken from a scene in Monty Python. It is exactly lifted from there, and that's quite astonishing. A few years later, further 5 British authors, as if by signals, because they're really all together, published their respective first medieval crime novels within a span of only 2 years. These are, all of them very successful writers, Candace Robb, Susanna Gregory, Peter Tremaine, Ian Morson, and Michael Jecks. They are the initiators of the second phase in the revision of the Middle Ages in crime fiction. As was the case with Doherty, some of these writers are amateur or professional historians. In their novels, the dark Middle Ages have moved a few steps further down in the darker depiction of crime. The use of refined psychology is far more prominent in the drawing of individual characters and the depiction of their actions. The representation of social and institutional corruption has expanded drastically. For example, the political and economic ethics of the ruling class. The language used by the character becomes rougher. Violence takes on highly sophisticated forms. The sleuths, landless knights, informant soldiers, reformer doctors, or even dissident theologians are not anymore idealized characters, yet they all retain a personal sense of justice that does not always adhere to the law. And here the model of Philip Marlowe from Raymond Chandler's novels is the archetypal hero, even though the presence of a legal judicial system reminds readers of the medieval roots of British common law. The novels are set in central or southern England, Wales, York, and Ireland. Susanna Gregory and Ian Morson, in particular, place their plots in the universities of Cambridge and Oxford, respectively, using in an intelligent way both the older British crime story of the academic milieu and the more recent campus novel. It's a combination of these two elements. In the middle of the 90s, and as an obvious response to the success of British medieval mysteries, a number of authors made their appearance in continental Europe. A small German publishing house in Cologne promoted the production of crime novels set in the town and its environs during different periods of the Middle Ages. For example, in a novel by Edgar Noske, the detective is no other than the famous nun and hymnographer of the 12th century, Hildegard von Bingen. The narrative is rather stiff, I must admit, and at times pedantic in the kind of German way that you get there, too much detail, while the artificial plot abounds in philosophical discussions. In France, on the other hand, the veteran journalist and historian Marc Payet, he died in 2000, published a series, 8 of them, of novels placed in the reign of Emperor Charlemagne, so in the very early 9th century. The sleuth is the serious Saxon priest and scholar Erwin of York, accompanied by his assistant, the cunning Timotheus, who is an iconoclast Greek fugitive from Bithynia. In contrast to the British medieval mysteries, the German and French novels did not meet with an international success. It is not easy to explain the reasons for their lukewarm reception. Maybe their strong local color did not appear attractive to the broader European reading public. Maybe their plots were viewed as unsatisfactory. Maybe the specific historical periods of the specific areas did not meet with the necessary interest. Maybe because the stories lack the subversive lightness of the English authors. The first novel, on the other hand, of the American lawyer Alan Gordon fared slightly better. Gordon, in using the main characters of Shakespeare's Twelfth Night, created in 13th Night, it was published in 2000, a jester detective at the end of the 12th century and sent him to solve a mystery in the fantastic Duchy of Illyria, the place where Twelfth Night takes place. The series continued with 3 further novels, bringing Jester Feste and his wife Viola to Constantinople shortly before the fall of the city to the Crusaders in 1204. The plots are not wholly convincing, but they are infused with humor and entertaining episodes, even though late Komnenian Byzantium appears to a professional Byzantinist like myself rather as an outlandish scenery without proper grounding in a functional historical reality. It could be more or less any place. There is one last group of historical crime novels whose plots are set in what we could broadly call medieval times, though the cultures depicted in these novels are not part of the conventional medium aevum, nor do their stories adhere to the popular romantic or revised image of the Western Middle Ages. The best known and most successful among them is the series written in English by the Dutch scholar and diplomat Robert van Gulik, who in the 50s and up to his death in 1967 created out of original 17th century Chinese judicial novels his detective Judge Di Yen Tie. Van Gulik used his intimate knowledge of Chinese culture and law to recreate the setting of 7th century imperial China of the Tang dynasty, one of the glorious moments of Chinese history and culture. By employing in an innovative manner the formula of the British riddle novel, Van Gulik offered to the reading public an insight into a decidedly non-Christian society with all its political, religious, and cultural differences, an absolute alternative to the Western Middle Ages. Directly inspired by Van Gulik, she, the author, Ingrid Parker, German-American author, launched in 2000 a series of novels situated in Imperial Japan of the 11th century with Sugawara Akitada as her character, as her detective, who is an impoverished nobleman related to the Sugawara family that is a side family, real, they exist, a side family of the Fujiwara family, which is one of the major aristocratic families of Japan. Some of the plots are indeed very interesting, though they do not reach the level of historical accuracy and inner consistency than Van Gulik achieved. At the same moment, at that time, the American couple Mary Read and Eric Meyer, I don't know if you've ever heard of them, introduced Byzantium as a setting of crime detection. Their detective, John the Eunuch, is one of the last pagans in the Christianized Imperium Romanum during the reign of Justinian and Theodora in 6th century Constantinople. However, on reading the novels, one gets the impression that the Justinianic era is nothing more than an updated version of older Roman imperial times in the style of Robert Graves' I, Claudius, with a dash of Christianity somewhere involved in it. To this group also, I would say, belong my own 3 novels, set in 9th century Byzantium during the reign of Emperor Theophilus, who is the last iconoclast ruler. I have tried to depict Byzantium from within by drawing the plots on the assumptions about crime as expressed in the respective legal texts of the time and as represented in the relevant sources, in an attempt to revise for the Greek reading public an equally resilient popular 19th century image of Byzantium. To give you an idea of how the Middle Ages have been textually reconstructed in crime fiction, I have chosen to examine more closely a secondary plot element. It is friendship. In our case, medieval friendship. I would somewhat broadly define friendship as an intellectual and emotional relationship of mutual benevolence between 2 persons equal in such a relationship. However, such a friendship is rarely depicted. But let me ask you the following question. Would you define the relationship between Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson as a friendship? Think about it for a moment. The opening scene in Conan Doyle's The Hound of the Baskervilles, 1902, offers a good view of this Victorian male relationship. Holmes asks Watson, who is as always the I narrator, it's he who tells the stories, to reconstruct, and these are the actual words, this is the actual word used by Holmes, a visitor at Baker Street from the walking stick he had forgotten there. Watson offers a very plausible explanation, only to be torn to pieces by Holmes in a very ironic discourse that the narrator does not perceive as such. Watson always refers to Holmes as his companion or friend. Recent critical discourse coming from gender studies has redefined this friendship of Holmes and Watson as based on a condition of superiority-inferiority, and this is exactly how Umberto Eco read the scene in the opening proper of The Name of the Rose, where William of Baskerville teaches young Adso, the Italian pronunciation of Watson, and I narrator of the novel, how to reconstruct a horse from its hoofprints. Adso always refers to William as his master in the Latin sense of magister, teacher. A teacher-pupil relationship accentuated by their age difference. This canonical superior sleuth, inferior sidekick relationship is repeated in a number of medieval mysteries, for example, Hugh Corbett and his manservant Ranulph in Doherty. There are, however, two narrative patterns constructing friendship that depart from this conventional schema. These are A, an ambivalent, often antagonistic or even clashing relationship between two men, and B, an equally ambivalent relationship between a man and a woman. In the first pattern, the sleuth, for example, Brother Athelstan in Doherty's late 14th century series, The Sorrowful Mysteries of Brother Athelstan, or the physician Matthew Bartholomew in Susanna Gregory's mid-14th century Bartholomew Chronicles, this is the one that is set in Cambridge University, has a friendship with a person who, in some official function, is responsible for law and order in the sleuth's social ambience. The Falstaffian coroner of London, Sir John Cranston, in Doherty, or the gluttonous brother Michael, responsible for a Cantabrigian college's order, in Susanna Gregory. The two male friends like each other, though they are of a very different character, while the sleuth is often annoyed or frustrated by the seemingly frivolous behavior of his friend and official colleague. The relationship, though, never crosses the limits set by the narrative function of detection. Deeper personal revelations or mental anxieties are not explored between the two male characters at all. The second pattern develops a different line with two interesting alternatives. Here, a man and a woman, either of them can be the sleuth, for example, Candace Robb's 14th century Owen Archer or Peter Tremaine's 7th century Sister Fidelma, have a relationship that is very personal and private in the sense that the two characters reveal their inner worlds to each other. The two alternatives of this pattern lie in the existence or not of a sexual side to the friendship. For example, Owen Archer falls in love and marries Lucy Wilton, the widow of the murdered apothecary in York. That's in the first novel of the series. Herself, Lucy, an accomplished apothecary. The two of them cooperate to a certain extent in solving the mystery, though more importantly, the author is interested in depicting a friendship in marriage based on mutual respect and equality, a modern concern rather than a medieval one. On the other hand, Bernard Knight's 12th century Sir John de Wolfe, who is the coroner of Exeter and 40 years of age, no young man in the 12th century, openly entertains a passionate, sexually satisfying and very personal relationship with the 20-year-old Welsh beauty Nesta, owner of one of Exeter's inns. Sir John, though, is married. He is married to the sister of the county's sheriff. Adultery now certainly was not an uncommon occurrence in medieval England, though here in the novel it is represented in a very modern, very public, and highly explicit way. However, most of the male-female friendships in the medieval mysteries are based on the absence of a sexual relationship. This absence, and that to me as a reader is very intriguing, is not based on the lack of any sexual or emotional desire, not at all, but on some socially defined constraint. In most cases, the sleuth is under holy orders. Doherty's brother Athelstan is in love with the attractive widow Benedicta, but cannot transgress his sacerdotal duties and sleep with her. Alice Clare's abbess Heloise is attracted to the French knight José d'Aquin, but also cannot step over the boundary set by her habit and position in her monastery. Andrea Schacht's intelligent Almut Bossart, a biguine virginal ascete in late 14th century Cologne, has a highly complex friendship with the Benedictine friar Ivo, so that both of them are constrained by their respective vows. Despite, therefore, the obvious presence of such personal relationships, firmly integrated into the detection part of the narratives, these friendships rather tend, in my opinion, to accentuate the loneliness of the human condition, thus reflecting social and psychological concerns of our times. Be that as it may, if we examine the international production of contemporary crime fiction set in medieval times, we cannot fail to recognize the supremacy of British medieval crime writing. What might then be the reasons for this supremacy of the English Middle Ages? I would suggest that it is firstly based on the special relationship of the English with their medieval past, especially in its popular dimension. Scott's Ivanhoe remains a living popular medieval romance, while Shakespeare's medieval history plays or historical tragedies, along with Marlowe's Edward II, are still popular theatre in England. Secondly, the indigenous crime novel, both in its Golden Age form as well as in its early post-war versions, still remains a well-read popular literary subgenre, offering to aspiring writers numerous opportunities for appropriation and subversion in a constant dialogue with an extremely informed reading public. Thirdly, when looking at the statistical distribution of the periods of medieval English history in which the crime novels of the last 30 years are set, we discover that most of them are acted out in only two periods. On the one hand, we have the 12th century of Richard the Lionheart and consequently of Ivanhoe. On the other, we find the 14th century of the murdered rulers of the Elizabethan stage. In other words, from Edward II to Richard II. To Richard II. These two centuries are also the periods of medieval English history best known to the broader European public. The only exceptions to this distribution are the novels of Peter Tremaine, 7th century Ireland, and Ian Morson, 13th century Oxford. Through their humorous tone and self-ironic discourse, many of these narratives express a differentiated, but no less, I would think, intense love of the English towards their national medieval history, and at the same time towards their national crime fiction. To come to a conclusion, What is the reconstructed image of the Middle Ages in contemporary crime fiction? First of all, in many instances, the Middle Ages are represented as an era with specific social characteristics that resemble the late 20th century, such as the representation of urban space, while medieval people appear to act in a manner that also reminds us of today's ways of behavior. At the same time, the mediumevum is depicted with certain characteristics that differentiate it decisively from the modern era. On the one hand, food, clothing, conditions within the urban and rural environments, climate and importance of weather conditions, technology are far removed from today's respective characteristics. On the other, the mentalities of people, personal piety, prejudices, superstitions, coexistence of pagan and Christian traditions, illiteracy and ecclesiastical education, gender roles also differ greatly. However, an unexpected feature emerges from a closer analysis of the texts. The characteristics I just mentioned as differentiating the Middle Ages from today appear as almost identical for all periods of medieval history. In other words, readers who have gone through the novels of 6 or 7 authors are not in a position to distinguish clearly between the external appearances of the settings represented in the stories, making, for example, the 7th and the 12th century resemble each other closely, which is not the case if you ask historians and archaeologists. It is in this feature that we detect our contemporary post-Romantic construction of a different and darker Middle Ages. Despite the interpretive efforts of recent historical and archaeological research, the Middle Ages of contemporary crime fiction are ultimately a unified imaginary space that is being primarily shaped and reshaped by means of 20th century textual and visual conventions rather than by advanced medieval scholarship. This is an exotic part of a broader medieval, this is an exotic space, part of a broader medievalism to which both Star Wars and The Lord of the Rings belong, that comes to offer its own image of a past alterity. It is highly entertaining and mostly safe construct, not unsimilar to 19th century Orientalism that had constructed its own highly entertaining but also totally safe image of a colonially defined Oriental alterity. Thank you. Certainly.
Do you want me to moderate, or are you happy to do this?
As you wish. I can moderate myself, I think. Okay. Right. Go ahead.
I actually do have. I'm going to start with a question. So I'm a reader of noir, like classic noir, California noir. You know, and the thing about noir, that one of the reasons why, like the gut punch that is delivered to the original readers, I think, had to do with the contrast between the image, the postcard image of California, and then the reality that they stripped back the same glossy surface. It showed you the dark reality.
Mm-hmm.
So do the medieval novels do the same thing? Is there a glossy surface? Is there a kind of a reveal that they're showing us, the dark truth beneath the surface in the medieval novels?
Well, what the the medievalist crime fiction does is that it presupposes, to a substantial extent, it presupposes that the readers are aware of the popular image of the nice and clean Middle Ages. So they play against it. You will not find, especially in the novels of the younger authors, you will not find an attempt at sort of tongue-in-cheek approach to playing with this image. As production grows, and as we have reached the 21st century, the medieval novels become in general darker and darker. They are not in any kind of way glossy or clean, but my point is that they do become, in becoming darker, this darker element is again a construct. That is, it does not reflect and it does not create a sense of real, I mean, in the sense of a novel proper, anxiety, fictional anxiety for the reader, so that you read a novel and then you get out of it and you feel deeply emotionally involved or in a state of mental disturbance. I mean, you get the kind of thing that you would get from reading, let me say, Paul Auster's novels, this kind of feeling. You don't get that at all, as you do in contemporary crime fiction. Think of some of the very successful Scandinavian authors, for example, but not only, since you mentioned California, James Ellroy's versions of California, which go far beyond anything that Chandler and Hammett ever produced. Again, consciously deconstructing them, but deconstructing them really to lead to a psychotic and disastrous story and plot, and the same feeling for the audience. This is not the case, because for better or for worse, in crime fiction, in medieval crime fiction, there has to be a solution to the crime, and some form of justice is delivered. It might not be the law itself, but something happens that gives you a sense that the sleuth or the law have managed to bring the murderer to some form of justice. There is no novel where you will find the murderer left completely untouched in whatever form. Or even psychotic situations like the detective being the murderer himself, for example, and such other situations. As you will get in contemporary American crime fiction. I mean, I'm thinking of, for example, the novels of the Greek-American writer George Pelecanos, who sets his novels in Washington, and they just punch you down. You read them and you're finished afterwards, but you like it. I mean, it gives you a very nice but very disturbing sense. You do not have that in medieval crime fiction. They are dark, yes, the king, there is this corruption around, but it doesn't go down deep into the situation.
Yes, I think Carla's question, as well as your talk, really highlighted the tension between a recognition of genre and a recognition of history. And I'm wondering to what extent we have, one of the dangers, and I think this was sort of expressed in your own sense of unease in the face of representations of Byzantium that could have been anywhere, right, or that we project our own fantasies onto these spaces, that this sort of medieval noir becomes essentially a space in which the public begins to mistake a particular genre for an actual historical information, right? The dark, the way that we can say in movies, right? How many movies representing the Middle Ages don't seem to ever have a sunny scene, right? But there's truly a darkness about it. I'm wondering, having the opportunity to address someone who's both a scholar and an author, to what extent you find yourself as an artist having to wrestle and negotiate with the demands of the genre and relate and what you expect an audience to be compelled by in relation to the kind of rigors that your disciplinary knowledge might feel it needs to impose on a narrative?
Immense. Because the first thing, if you come from scholarship to writing, and fiction in particular, you are confronted with a sense of a void because you don't have footnotes. Right? So this already puts you in a difficult position. The second thing is that scholarship, of course, I mean, the main aim of scholarship is to detect the gaps, to present gaps, to leave them open. It is not there to create fully and completely reconstructed images of anything. But when you have to narrate a scene, you have to decide, even if you don't know, how the boot of the guy who is walking on the street and is going to do something looks, because you have to take a decision about that damn boot, right? Or the door, or the way in which he, she are dressed. So once you step over this boundary, this difficulty, the way I do it is that I let my experience of the sources and my experience of the material to drive me into fictional writing, so that I allow myself the freedom of writing on the basis of what I have in my mind. And then what I do is that in the case of the Byzantine novels is I cannot use immediately, directly, in a one-to-one relation, the conventions of crime novels, of detective novels, because they were composed and they were conceived for a completely different society. Like in Byzantium, there is no such thing as crime detection. The corpses were lying on the street and someone threw them in a dump, or there was a grave for paupers, right, or unknown people. No one cared to examine and detect in some kind of way a crime unless it was brought to a judge, in front of a judge, and then the judge had to make some decisions. Therefore, what do? Who is taking up the role of a detective? I mean, what is the person that starts thinking? So you can either do it like most of the crime writers do, namely they just take the convention for granted and they use a clever individual that gets involved, and the clever individual is usually of a shady background. You see, the dissident soldiers, the informants, the problematic theologians. So he's someone, or she is someone, or the woman happens to be someone who is considered a half-witch of sorts, or she is the virginal Sister Fidelma, who simply is totally idealized by Peter Tremaine. I mean, he's in love with her, it's obvious. And theoretically that functions. But when you read it, you have immediately the sense that this is a contemporary situation. So what I try to do is to find the equivalent way of thinking in the time, in that time. So, for example, my detective reads ancient Greek erotic literature, which people did in the early 9th century. So it is from this erotic literature that he actually sees and tries to understand the behavior of the women, not from his own reality, because he has none. He's not married, he has a traumatic erotic life behind him. So it is through the books that he actually, and there's a character in one of my novels who actually tells him that. Stop looking at life through books, but that's what I know to do. And then so he goes about doing, and that is something that we know from the sources. We know that the Byzantines did that very much. Ultimately, it's fictional. So that's how I would work with that. Yes. Situation. Well, on the one hand, yes, there was actually a production of crime writing in Greece in before the Second World War and after the Second World War. There were two crime story journals where that published, similar like The Mask in America. They published short stories. Most of them were translations from English or French. But there were a number of writers who, with under pen names, produced stories originally written in Greek, but pretending to be translations of French or American or English stories. That's very interesting. And that you find that even after the Second World War happening. But there is actually a pretty interesting contemporary production that started in the late 90s, and you will find authors that write in Greek, developing different styles, based, however, very much on what kind of writers, European or American writers, they actually have read or worked with. And it's not a coincidence that the two most successful writers of contemporary now crime fiction in Greece, Petros Markaris on the one hand and Andreas Apostolidis on the other, have both been translators of important American crime fiction writers. Markaris translated the novels of the very good American woman writer Sarah Paretsky and her Chicago-based novels. And Andreas Apostolidis is the translator of I just mentioned him, James Elroy. And in fact, he has written a novel. It's his most ambitious and complex one, that he even subtitles a Greek tabloid in relation to Elroy's an American tabloid. So it makes this kind of thing explicit. In my case, I mean, there is no other Greek writer who writes historical crime fiction. It was funny, one critic who discussed one of my novels said, "Oh, it's quite a pity. I could imagine, for example, a detective who is a fighter in the Greek Revolution and is with his, he's an Albanian Greek of sorts, and we can deconstruct a little bit the birth of the Greek nation and have a detective and so on." But that was a very intelligent idea, actually, but no one has tried to pick that up, and I think the reason is that people feel that they need to do too much work for this kind of writing, and there doesn't seem to be. I don't know. On the other hand, as I said, many of the successful English British crime writers have been translated in Greek, so that actually the Greek reading public reads these kind of novels. Ellis Peters has been very successful. Kate Sedley has been translated. Doherty has been translated. Michael Jacks. I mean, there's a lot of that. And not only medieval, but also of other periods. I mean, the Roman period also. Italian authors have been translated into Greek. But Heroides, yeah, but that of course, is the kind of a novel that is so far removed in terms of style and the way in which it is written from contemporary Greek writing practices that I don't think that anyone can use it as a kind of model. At least I did not in the least. I mean, and so what I tried to do, on the other hand, was to develop a type of style that in certain aspects used my experience of Byzantine Greek. So, for example, I do not write let us say, very realistic dialogues. The dialogues have a certain formality to them, at least in certain respects, because I try to get something of the way in which we see Byzantines talking to each other in the Byzantine texts. Or I use the techniques of Byzantine description of works of art, the ekphrasis, in order to create characters. And then I have characters commenting on this to give a sense to the modern reader that this is a different way of looking at the world. So like when my detective discovers that the daughter of the general of the town is in love with his young adjutante, and both the parents of the daughter have not discovered it, and he discovered it, understands it by correlating the way that the two of them behave to a very famous flirting scene in Heliodorus's Ethiopian Tales, which was a bestseller in Byzantium. So you have this kind of way. But what I can say is that I got a lot of positive reader response, because people could find me. They Googled me and just found my address, my university address, and so they wrote to me about the actual Greek writing. They felt that they enjoyed it because it didn't look like translated Greek, but like really an author who writes in the original language. They enjoyed that very much. And I can understand that, because translations of cheap literature are usually cheap. That's how it goes.
I thank you very much for the talk, and I liked how you ended it with an allusion to Star Wars and Lord of the Rings, because throughout the talk I was thinking about how your remarks could apply to other subgenres of fantasy literature, or that use the medieval period as, or an image of the medieval world
As a
basis. So I was wondering, within, say, epic fantasy or high fantasy, are there other subgenres of or genres of writing that support this general transition to a darker yet equally safe Middle Ages that you've been describing, or are there maybe direct writers who go against that trend?
In general, fantasy writing is, again, it's a world of its own. I mean, the authors and the fans of fantasy writing are not necessarily the same people who read medieval crime fiction, because the fantasy is very strongly connected also to scientific fantasy, and that is where the Lucas and Lord of the Ring connection, Star Wars and makes itself very present. But on the whole, if you look at contemporary production of fantasy, you can see that they are far darker and far more technologically developed than they used to be 30 years ago. And in general, I think there is a tendency into darkening fiction, because it's simply we have moved into a postmodern world where things are not anymore nice and clean and proper, but the question is this darker you find it, for example, and there are quite a number, especially in France, of graphic novels and comic novels that deal with the Middle Ages in this extremely dark kind of way, with very pronounced erotic accentuation of the erotic side of it. But okay, we know the French, that's their hobby, but nonetheless, you do have that. Unfortunately, it has not been, these are parts of popular culture that have not been studied at all, although they are very thriving. I mean, in production and in revenues. I mean, people make money, both publishers and writers from that. It would be interesting to compare, which I have not done, older fantasy novels that are used for new versions in television and movie, and see how the distinction or the time gap has shifted the way in which the novels are presented in the time. And I'm thinking, of course, of the Game of Thrones, then you know it's very fashionable nowadays. But actually, most people have seen the recent TV series, but not gone back to read the early novels of the early 90s when the don't even remember the name of the author started writing them. Yeah, it would be interesting to see that how. Because I remember an interview of him where he said that in his most recent novels, he actually takes the image making of the TV series into consideration, so that he is shifting into a different mode by introducing the TV image into his writing, rather than letting the one develop independent of his own. So he's actually exploiting something that has taken place into his own kind of writing, and making it therefore even more dark, even more, people want that in some kind of way. I don't know, but I don't feel, and that's my personal feeling, I don't feel that these darker images are really dark. They're externally dark. Definitely, you are quite right. But unfortunately, that's quite interesting. I would say, and now please don't misunderstand what I'm going to say. I think that my novels are the only ones that introduce a spy espionage element, because usually this is not the case. The settings of the medieval novels are very fixed and set. They're very placed in a specific context. And you do have people coming in from all sorts of various places, but not because they spy on anybody. The whole idea of espionage is not part of the way in which writers write them. And I think this comes because their basic mental frame is the British cozy mystery, where there is no crime fiction, no espionage element involved. And even if there is a political, let's say, framework where the king appears or something takes place, the actual plot is not involved in politics in order to bring out an espionage element. And that's why I'm saying in the case of my novels, this is different, because my detective is in fact the ambassador of the emperor to various places. So in the first novel, he goes to Baghdad to meet the caliph and discuss a potential peace treaty, and he finds himself stuck at the borders, in a town at the borders that is teeming with spies. So it's like a complete espionage situation that he finds himself involved in. In the third novel, he having failed as an ambassador to a mission to the emir, the Arab emir of Crete, and he returns. He stops. The ship stops in an island, in an island, where he finds himself again confronted with a secondary espionage case. And this is because I choose to put my novels in a political context. So there's always a political side to the novels, and under or next to it, there is a detection element which might or might not be, usually is, connected to the political side. It might involve an erotic drama or all sorts of things, but all that is always connected to a political side. But no, espionage is not really used. But I think this is also related to the very strong presence of technology and techniques in espionage that you cannot really develop that easily in crime fiction of the Middle Ages. You know, what kind of decoding systems, what kind of minute photographing techniques and microfilms and all these things that make espionage of the 60s so attractive, and the equivalent films, of course. You cannot get that what are you going to do? You're going to run with a parchment codex around doing what? So you don't have that. You have to, and that's why Byzantine history allows for that, because the Byzantines did have spies, and they used espionage for war information and military information, especially from the Arabs. And that's where we get most of the information, either from the Byzantine sources or the Arab sources telling us about Byzantine spies. And that is a tradition of the Roman army. It goes back to Roman espionage. And that's how the Byzantines got their information. You don't have that in the West. Obviously, kings, rulers, and politicians had to be informed. But we don't know that much about the ways of information in feudal societies. We have to move into the Renaissance to find that. And we find it in the Italian city-states, because they needed it for their trade.
That's another series of novels.
Yeah,
I think we're going to have to wrap up there, and I'm saying
Thank you very much.